A customer recently asked us, what is the best way to override an Oracle-defined style? And that is such a great question. You know, it's such a great question because there's so many answers to that question. And we're going to answer that question, but not yet. In a prior episode, we discussed the cascading nature of CSS, how we can override CSS at the property level through CSS declarations. With our button example, for example, we saw that all buttons have a default color. Here, let's find our button. The same example we worked with before. We find our button here, and well, we're not looking at the default color yet. Let's reset this. So we see the default color for a button. Okay, that's perfect. This is what a button looks like on 858 in the absence of any CSS overrides. But we also saw that by adding one more style class, we can change the appearance. But what we really have is we have two different declarations or two different selectors identifying the same HTML element, setting the properties differently. So the question we have to ask is, if there are two CSS selectors targeting the same element, setting the same attribute a different way, which one wins? And the answer to that is something called selector specificity. Which selector is more specific? You see, almost all, and this is awesome, this is how it should be. Almost all fluid selectors start out with a base. That's what we see here. So here, let's get rid of the primary. PSC primary style class, the override, the Oracle delivered override. And we look at the selector, we see PS button. So this is the base, PS button, all by itself, just PS button. Now when we add the PSC primary, we create a selector that's more specific than the prior. So the prior was just PS button. Now we have a hierarchical or ancestral selector where we say, okay, PS button, but only when it's PS button that's a child of. See, this selector here, the PS button that's a child of PSC primary, is more specific than the original selector. The original selector being just PS-button. So if we want to override an Oracle delivered style, we need to make, or what I recommend, is that we create a selector that is more specific than the Oracle delivered selector. See, there are actually a couple of different ways we can, so to speak, win the attribute war here with CSS selectors. One of them is to be the last selector to be defined. For example, let's say that the Oracle has the PSC underscore primary space PS-button selector. We can see that right here. This selector. Now let's say that we redefine that exact same selector, but ours is the last one. I mean, think of it this way. Think of it that, let's say you have a hash table, a hash table being a series of buckets. And each one of those points to some value, right? Some set of rules. So if we think of each one of those definitions there, PSC primary, okay, Oracle defined it in PS style def f mode at line 2258. Okay, now let's say that we define it a little bit later, but we define it differently. The exact same selector. Well, when the browser interprets that information, it says, okay, we've created the bucket, we've set the rule. Oh, look at that. Somebody's redefined the bucket. So it's going to set the exact same selector to have a completely different series of attributes, or perhaps override just one of. Maybe perhaps we're just overriding the color, but we're retaining the background and the border. Or actually, in our case, we're going to flip that around, aren't we? We're going to stick with white, but we're going to, which is the color, or should I say an off-white, but we're going to override the background and the border. That's what we're going to do. Now that's one way. One way is last rule wins, but last rule wins depends on loading order. And when we're working in a framework such as PeopleTools, or any framework for that matter, where the application owns the content, we don't really have control over load order. See, we can think we have control over load order, and most of the time we'll be correct. But the reason we don't have control over load order in this situation is because Oracle is using Ajax and it's loading content at different times and different places. Let me give you a great example of that. In a new window, I'm going to return home. And on my homepage here, this happens to be HR, and most of the Oracle delivered HR tiles were delivered in 854 prior to Tile Wizard. Most of these are fluid pages and components. And these fluid pages and components might define a style or redefine a style and then redefine it again. See what I'm saying? This tile here versus that tile there, which one loads first? Who knows? Who cares actually? Oh, even better. Let's go into my team. You know what's on the side of the right-hand side of my team? A whole bunch more tiles. Every single one of those tiles having the potential to load in a different order and change or redefine the CSS used globally across the page. I don't think we should depend on load order, but rather instead on selector specificity. So what does that mean? If we want to override the Oracle delivered styles, we need more specific selectors. How do you do that? Well, we saw one option. One option is the ancestral selector. Further qualify the target. In this case, we want PS buttons that happen to be children of PS primary that are also something else. Pick it, anything. Oh, what about this? What if we just go in here and we create? So we use a site-specific prefix here at JSM Pros. It's JSM. What if we create our own style? Well, then we would define our own attributes there. But is that really overwriting the Oracle delivered style? No. See, when we're talking about overwriting the Oracle delivered style, what we're saying is, hey, PSC primary, yeah, it looks blue here, but we want it to be, what was it, dark orange with a red-orange border, orange-red border. So we want to override this style, maybe perhaps at a page level, maybe perhaps at a component level, maybe perhaps on a global level. We haven't got to that yet. We'll get to that in a future episode. But right now, what we want to talk about is how would we write the selector to override the attributes? So ancestral, we further qualify, but there's one selector, and well, best practices discourage the use of this type of selector. But I'm going to point it out here because it's an almost guaranteed a win selector when we're trying to overwrite an Oracle delivered style. And so I reach for it just about every time. Yeah, even though it's discouraged, this is the one case where I think it's a good idea. Now, one of the things we have to think about when we're writing CSS selectors, because writing CSS selectors is a bit of a science. See, there's a performance impact. I mean, think about it. When we start from a CSS selector, oftentimes the CSS selector engines will start at the end and say, okay, give me all the PS buttons. Okay, now throw away all the PS buttons that aren't children of PSC primary. So there's a science to CSS selectors because of performance. And the way we write our CSS selectors can have an impact on performance. We want to start with the most specific and then work to the least specific. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it's a little bit of trial and error to figure out, hey, is there a better way to write that selector? There are a couple of selector types that we should try to avoid though. For example, the attribute selector or the partial match selector. Actually, I'll tell you, I love attribute selectors. Use them all of the time. But a partial match selector is one of those that we probably want to avoid. Partial matches mean an attribute value that begins with or ends with or contains. They kind of have to do something sort of like a regular expression match. Of course, that's going to be more performance intensive. But the one selector, the most specific selector you can identify is the ID selector. I like that. I like the ID selectors. Now, most people discourage the use of ID selectors because they are specific. And basically what you're doing is writing a style for one item with an ID selector, usually. That doesn't make any sense. Why do that? No, create a class of objects and define the styles for that. That way it's more generic. That makes sense. Okay, but here, so let's talk about these ID selectors. So I can see there is an ID selector here. Oh, that is a really interesting looking ID, isn't it? Actually, it is. And I discourage the use of ID selectors on specific individual elements. See, it has an 18 here. Where does that 18 come from? I don't even know. Oftentimes it's the row number, it's the row within the level. Other things you'll find is you'll find the number, the window ID. For example, this is Win0. You don't see a 0 there, but if I go to my team, you see it's 13. And if we inspect here, we're going to find in the HTML, Win 13. Let's keep working our way through the HTML. Yeah, see, it's all over here in the HTML. ID, Win13, 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 Win13. Why? Because it's window number 13. And that was a legacy approach that the PeopleTools team used that became important when we were talking about pagelets in Classic. Personally, it's a practice I would like to see eliminated from the Oracle delivered HTML. But it is what it is, and it's something that we need to be careful of. And actually, if there's ever a time that I'm going to use a partial match CSS selector, that's when it's going to be. When I need to identify a specific element, but I cannot do it by window number. Okay, now there are some ID selectors that we can see here that have a fixed ID. Those are perfect to use as an ancestral selector. Now, the reason I'm pointing them out is because I haven't seen Oracle use them. Here, let's just drill into PS_Style_Def mode, for example. PS_Style_Def mode, this is the fluid style library. It's actually a composite library. It is a top-level style sheet consisting of a whole bunch of sub-style sheets, mostly freeform style sheets. Actually, it might be all freeform style sheets. Anyway, let's look for some of those elements. Let's look for an ID selector of PT content or PT main. PT underscore content, 0 found. PT main, 0 found. Actually, that's awesome. I'm so glad Oracle didn't use those. Why? So I can. It makes it so much easier for me to write a selector because I don't have to worry about, hey, does Oracle have a future selector that's more qualified than mine? No. No, they don't, because they didn't use ID. Now, have they used ID selectors anywhere? That's a good question. Oh, actually, they have. Look, see, you can see it right there. So there are times, well, what is an ID selector? An ID selector is any selector that starts with a hash symbol, £, versus a class-specific selector, which always starts with a dot. An element-style selector, which is also another way we can further qualify our selectors, starts with an element. What's an element? Well, it's an HTML element, but basically, from a CSS perspective, it's any text string, text token that does not start with a dot, does not start with a hashtag, or does not start with brackets, square brackets. See, the square bracket is the attribute selector. Those are the three primary types of selectors they have available to us that we can then mix together to create these composite or ancestral selectors. Okay, let's finish up ours here really quickly. So I want to create a new style rule. And again, I'm just mocking this up in the browser. It's not being persisted. So as soon as I hit the refresh button, it's all gone. Or even worse, this has happened to me before. You're working, you're prototyping, and you step away, you get a phone call, something interrupts you, and you come back and your session is timed out and all of that prototyping you did in your browser, it's gone. It's gone because your session timed out and your browser navigated to the sign out or sign in screen, destroying all of that temporary in-memory CSS. Oh, anyway, something to keep in mind and to watch out for. Let's go ahead. Let's click the plus sign here in the Styles panel to create a new style class. We can see that the browser defaulted to an ID, an element ID selector. No, that's too specific. We want to be all PSC primaries. So buttons that are primary. So let's start with ours. We can go with PT main, PT content. I'm comfortable with any one of those. I'm going to go with PT main because it happens to be the lowest level. The good news is since I have another level up, I could, for example, create a further qualified by saying PT main or PT content PT main. You know what? You can keep going up even. We see there's PT wrapper up here. And above that, the page name, yeah, no, I don't think so. Anyway, you get the idea. You can keep working your way up, further qualifying these if you have to. PT main, there's my timeout warning. Remember what I was saying. If it timed out, oh, how sad. Click somewhere else and I lost my selector. Let's start again. # PT main dot PSC primary. We're working ancestrally here. So we're starting at the top, PT main. Next comes PSC primary, and after that is PS button. Dot PS underscore button. A dash button. Okay, and now when I hit the enter key, if I see dark black text, then my selector matches the element that's highlighted. If I see lighter gray, as we see down here, my selector does not match. And then I have to scratch my head and look back to see and figure out, what did I do wrong? Well, here, the PSC primary has background color, color, and border color. We're just going to override 2 of these. Let's override the background color, and let's go with, what did we use in the prior episode? It was dark orange. Yeah, I like that. And then we did the border color. We did that red-orange. Or excuse me, orange-red. Perfect, I like it. You can slightly see the outline there. Now, there's one other thing I did in the prior episode. I'm not sure if we really want to do this. I'm going to point it out anyway. Font-weight, just for something different. Now, watch the button. When I enter bold, watch the button. Did you notice the button changed width? It changed size. It got a little bit bigger there. Why is that? It's because the characters, and see, the buttons are sized based on their content. The content inside the button became wider, so the button itself became wider. Now, the reason I say I'm not sure we want to do that is because we're now starting to play with the dimensions of the content, which may have a downstream impact on the content and the alignment and layout that Oracle created when they delivered the pages to us. So I think changing color, changing border color, that's all great. But once you start playing with the size, it starts to get a little bit, you can do it, absolutely. You just have to be careful, and you want to do a little bit of testing around it, which is why I'm pointing it out here. Okay, great. Now we have this in our browser right now. It's ready to go. I love what I'm seeing. It's actually mocked up here in a quote inspector style sheet. Everything that I typed in, it's right here in a, you notice the exclamation here. It says, these changes are not saved to the file system. It's temporary, but it's right here, just waiting for me to copy and paste to persist into PeopleTools. But hey, we're going to save that for another episode. With Fluid being Oracle's strategic direction, we believe Fluid is one of the most important PeopleTools technologies to learn, and that is why we teach it several times per month. Be sure to check out our website to see when we're offering it next. Or here's an idea, subscribe to our LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter feeds to receive updates every time we post a course. Or do you have a team that wants to learn Fluid? Give us a call and let's get something scheduled for you. Now, before we go, I have a question for you. Do you have a topic you would like us to cover in a future soundbite? Let us know by sharing your idea at soundbytes.jsmpros.com. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more content. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.